Some of the most important connections in your life do not begin with intensity, clarity, or immediate recognition, but with something deceptively simple. An encounter that appears ordinary on the surface, yet leaves behind a strange psychological imprint that you cannot fully justify. There is nothing dramatic about the moment itself, no clear reason to assign importance to it, and yet something lingers, something that remains present in your thoughts longer than expected, without effort or intention. This is where the process begins, not in what is visibly significant, but in what quietly persists. According to Carl Jung, certain encounters activate deeper layers of the psyche, especially when they resonate with unconscious structures that are already prepared for that connection. This is why the moment feels heavier than it should, not because of what happened externally, but because of what was triggered internally. You may find yourself recalling small details without knowing why, replaying brief interactions that would normally be forgotten, or feeling a subtle shift in your attention that redirects itself toward that person without conscious effort. This is not driven by logic or intention, but by recognition that has not yet reached the level of awareness. What makes this stage difficult to understand is that nothing concrete has happened yet, and yet something has already started to organize itself within you. The encounter does not demand attention, but it does not disappear either, and that persistence is what differentiates it from every other ordinary interaction. As this initial encounter settles into your mind in a way that feels disproportionate to what actually happened, something deeper begins to form, not through interaction, but through an internal response that develops independently of time, logic, or shared experience. The connection does not grow in the traditional sense. It appears already present, as if something within you recognized meaning before there was enough evidence to justify it. You may notice that your emotional response feels ahead of reality, that your level of awareness toward this person does not match the amount of interaction you have had, and that there is a subtle sense of familiarity that cannot be explained through memory or shared history. This is not attachment built through time, but resonance that exists prior to it. According to Carl Jung, certain connections activate archetypal patterns within the psyche, meaning that the emotional intensity does not come from the present interaction alone, but from deeper psychological structures that are being engaged. This creates the impression that the connection is unfolding faster internally than externally, because part of it is not being created in real time, but accessed. This is why the connection may feel difficult to rationalize, because it does not follow a predictable sequence, and it does not depend on continuous interaction to remain present. Even in absence, the awareness remains, not as obsession, but as a quiet, consistent presence that does not require reinforcement. What distinguishes this stage is that nothing concrete has been established, yet something has already taken form internally, and that internal formation begins to influence how you perceive, respond, and even anticipate what may come next. As the connection continues to exist internally, something unexpected begins to happen externally, because instead of everything aligning in a direct and immediate way, circumstances start to interfere, timing feels inconsistent, and situations arise that create distance or delay the natural progression of the relationship. At first, this can be interpreted as a clear sign that things are not meant to happen, because the external reality does not match the internal sense of connection. However, what defines this stage is that despite these interruptions, the connection does not weaken. It maintains its presence without requiring constant reinforcement. And in some cases, it becomes even more defined through absence rather than proximity. This creates a paradox where distance does not dissolve the connection, but instead clarifies it internally. According to Carl Jung, the psyche does not develop in a linear way, and meaningful psychological processes often require periods of separation, delay, or external misalignment in order to allow internal structures to form without interference. What appears externally as obstruction can function internally as organization, creating space for both individuals to process, integrate, and align with what the connection represents. This is why these delays feel different from simple disinterest or incompatibility, because the connection does not fade when interaction decreases, and the internal awareness of it remains stable even when external conditions are inconsistent. The absence does not create detachment, it creates definition. What becomes important at this stage is not the immediate outcome, but the pattern itself, because when a connection persists without continuous external support, it indicates that its foundation is not based solely on circumstance, but on something that has already been structured internally. At a certain point, the most noticeable change is no longer the connection itself, but what begins to happen within you as a result of it. Because without any formal relationship, without defined roles or shared structure, your internal state starts to reorganize in ways that feel subtle but consistent. This shift does not depend on interaction or confirmation. It happens independently, as if something in your psyche is already adjusting to a reality that has not yet fully manifested externally. You may begin to notice changes in your priorities, in the way you perceive relationships, and even in the standards you hold for connection. Not because someone told you to change, but because something within you no longer aligns with previous patterns. Certain behaviors that once felt acceptable begin to feel out of place. Certain emotional dynamics lose their appeal, and there is a growing sense that you are moving towards something more specific, even if you cannot fully define it yet. According to Carl Jung, when a meaningful connection is activated, it often initiates an internal process of reorganization where the psyche begins to align itself with what that connection represents on a deeper level. This means that before the relationship exists in a concrete form, the internal conditions for it are already being structured, not through conscious effort, but through gradual psychological adjustment. This stage is important because it is not driven by expectation, but by alignment. And that alignment begins to influence your decisions, your boundaries, and your awareness in ways that feel natural rather than forced. The connection is no longer something you are simply observing. It becomes something that is actively shaping how you position yourself in relation to the world. At the final stage, the connection is no longer something you analyze, question, or try to understand because it has already moved into a more subtle level where it begins to influence your behavior without requiring conscious effort. This is not about obsession or constant thinking, but about a quiet integration where the presence of that person becomes part of how you make decisions even when they are not physically present. You may begin to notice that certain choices are made differently, not because you are trying to impress or adapt, but because your internal alignment has shifted. Your tolerance for what does not match that connection becomes lower. Your clarity about what you want becomes sharper, and your actions begin to reflect a version of yourself that is more consistent with what that connection represents. According to Carl Jung, when something becomes psychologically significant, it is integrated into the structure of the psyche, influencing behavior in a natural and automatic way. This means that the connection is no longer external. It has become part of your internal organization, shaping perception, priorities, and direction without requiring constant attention. What defines this stage is that there is no longer a sense of effort involved, because the influence does not feel imposed, it feels inherent. The connection is not something you are trying to build anymore. It is something that is already affecting how you exist, how you choose, and how you respond to life. At this point, the process is no longer about recognizing signs, but about noticing how much has already changed without force, because what was once external has been internalized. And that internalization naturally begins to reflect itself in reality over time.